So our next presentation is by Dr. Erik Rasmussen, Perspectives on Pandemic Risk and Response. Now, I'll be brief, but in fact, Erik has an extraordinary background in both medicine. He was chair of the Department of Medicine in the Navy Medical Center in Seattle. He directed an intensive care unit, so he really knows about hands-on medicine. He's been a naval officer for 25 years, formerly a commander in the Navy. Then he moved to Google, where he chaired an NGO instead, running the TED Prize. I'm sure all of you know about the TED lectures on the internet, and I think he's still chair of that. He's the CEO of two companies, one in the US and one in Mexico. He works, dedicates himself to humanitarian support, and he leads disaster response teams globally. That's a magnificent curriculum vitae, and we're very happy and privileged to welcome you, Erik. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Good morning. It's very nice to be here with you this morning. And I appreciate the fact that the translators need to take my words into Chinese. We're going to try to pace that appropriately. I know very, very little about traditional Chinese medicine. And the talk that we just heard from Bison, I found fascinating, and I would like to learn more. But my training is in traditional Western medicine, and so you're going to hear this morning a little bit of context for the current state of risk affiliated with infectious diseases around the world. First, I thought I would start, just to make sure that the projector was working, with one of the most beautiful images I've ever seen of the planet Mercury. This was a flyby that took place on the 17th of March of this year, and I just wanted to let you know that it's a pretty planet. We'll move on. So we're going to talk a little bit about emerging infections and what risks they pose to the globe, and in particular dense populations like those in China. For those that might appreciate the image behind it, you'll notice that I like photographs and I like digital abstract art, but that is that is not digital abstract art. That's a photograph of the Icelandic volcano eruption 3 years ago. Not photoshopped at all. That's really what it looked like. I found that fantastic. So, there are some infectious disease transmission risks that we did not have 25 years ago. This is from the University of Surrey in April, pressing iPhones and Androids into bacteriological media. And as they said in their report, they did not have long to wait before the bacteria began to grow. So when we talk about the things that have changed in our understanding of infectious disease transmissibility, let's add cell phones. There was a time when infectious diseases killed a very large fraction of the human population each year. Beginning about 125 years ago, through changes mostly in public health, the separating of human shit from drinking water, we began to see tremendous improvements in the transmissibility of disease. You'll notice that massive spike that is the influenza epidemic that Dr. Arthur just talked about. And the man who is pictured there is Alexander Fleming from a few hundred miles south of here in London, and his discovery of penicillin, a mold that seemed to have antibacteriological properties. We have worked hard to eradicate diseases that have been scourges of the planet since time immemorial. We've only succeeded twice. One is a livestock disease called rinderpest. The other, of course, is smallpox. The numbers associated with the deaths that used to be caused by smallpox are astonishing. and they are also very recent. You'll notice that well within living memory, millions died every year from smallpox. That's no longer the case. We succeeded in understanding the transmission pathways, interrupting those transmission pathways, and having the disease die out as a natural method of transmission everywhere on the planet. It's gone. It's a fantastic achievement for humanity. Unfortunately, there are many, many other diseases to go. The current list of infectious diseases is about 225 long, and this is just the A's. This is just to show you that there is a great deal still to do, and much of what we need to do we don't fully understand for many of these infectious diseases. These are viruses, they are bacteria, they are fungi, they are protozoa. They come in a lot of different flavors, but all of them cause misery to humans. We have found some ways to kill bacteria as they grow inside humans, inside animals, and inside plants. In our case, the human therapy, antibiotics, got started only about 125 years ago. And it looks like we probably will not have much longer that we can take advantage of this particular technique for controlling infectious diseases. You'll notice that as the years went on through the 20th century, we developed more and more antibiotics because we needed to have more and more ways to address the very clever ways that germs, bacteria, viruses, protozoa, fungi, can evade the processes that we had for antibiosis. Here is an example of just how many ways we tried to address just bacteria: cell walls, cell membranes, reproductive processes internally, energy processes internally. There are many ways to interrupt the life cycle of an organism, and we have tried all that we can figure out how to do. Unfortunately, we're losing our capabilities. Bacteria really are very clever, as are all of the other classes of organisms, and they adapt, just as you were hearing Professor Arthur describe humans adapting to syphilis. There are a number of articles that have been published over the last few years about just what the risks look like. And here is a map that helps give you some understanding of what's happening. Those items that are listed in blue are those that are re-emerging as threats when we thought we had them under fairly good control. The ones that are red are relatively new. We haven't seen them much before as human pathogens. And there's one on there that is black. And that's a reminder that there is a malignancy in human behavior that occasionally uses biology against humans, and that black entry is the anthrax that was used as a biological weapon about a decade ago. Still not fully understood who or why or in what fashion, but it is clear that biology now can be used as a weapon in ways that are far more sophisticated than they were when we were putting smallpox blankets into the Native American populations in the United States. In the United States in particular, we have infectious diseases under reasonably good control right now. Those are an accurate reflection of the decrease in incidence for infectious diseases inside the borders of the United States. It looks pretty impressive. Unfortunately, elsewhere in the world, that's not really true. That first column, all those things that seem to be new, looking at HIV and all the way down, there are many more that could be listed there, but we'll leave it at that. On the second column, those diseases that we knew about but hadn't been much of an issue are getting more and more and more important in the human species. Let's look just at three. You see the three that are in yellow? You see MERS, you see chikungunya, and you see livestock pathogens. Let's look at MERS first because it's happening right now. It's happening this week. You saw in Professor Arthur's talk that the influenza in 1917 killed about 2.5% of the people that infected. In epidemiology, we call that a case fatality rate, CFR. 2.5% and 50 million died. Now we're looking with MERS at a case fatality rate of almost half. Almost half of the people who get this disease die. That's a phenomenal number. It's also remarkable to recognize the age of the people who are dying. They're about my age. I'm actually pretty healthy. I have nothing going on that I know of, and yet if I get this disease, odds are good that I could succumb to it. I could die of this viral disease, this novel coronavirus. That disease had been contained pretty thoroughly in the Middle East, and as you see from the Medscape report, we have seen our first and now our second and now our third case of MERS inside the United States. Now, obviously, I have a particular focus on those issues that affect the United States. At the moment, as far as I know, there have been no cases inside China. I may be mistaken on that. I don't track that literature. But be aware that this is a highly transmissible disease, although it is in, apparently, an animal reservoir, camels. And so you see the man protecting himself as he feeds his camels. That doesn't happen very easily inside the Middle East, so it's unlikely we're going to get this under control anytime soon. Here's the second of the three diseases. Most of you probably have not run across this word, chikungunya. It's been underway since about 1943. There is a case set established in Ravenna, Italy now, for complicated reasons, and it has spread gradually across the Central Asian states, down into Southeast Asia, and now into the Caribbean, where we have over 3,000 cases just since the first of the year. It is going to be coming into the United States. It is going to be coming into China. And in fact, it wouldn't surprise me if it's already in China. Someone in the room may know more about than I do. But just kind of tuck it away. Chikungunya, an unusual word, is going to be a part of your professional life over the next decade. And this one you probably haven't heard about at all, but it's one of two that I want to describe to you that have very severe impacts on things related to humans, but do not actually hurt humans. This is nothing that touches humanity. It touches the things that humanity finds important. This is a virus that was first discovered about 2.5 years ago on one farm in Germany. And by May of this year, last month, those are the number of countries that are now infected by Schmallenberg virus. It does not affect humans at all. It only affects sheep, goats, and a little bit cattle. It causes stillbirths and deformations, and it has caused a reduction in imports of sheep, cattle, goats, and the germplasm that goes along with their reproduction and breeding in multiple countries. Excuse me, in multiple countries throughout the world. They are banned, right? Those imports are banned, and that has affected trade. And the vector is a midge, a little no-see-um, a little tiny thing that you see flying around in the evening. We did hear mention that many of the disease processes we're seeing now are the result of the intersection between humans and the animals that used to be quite separated from us. I took this photograph in Cambodia, and in fact, I think Dr. Kimball and I were standing near each other at the time, working in Southeast Asia. And what you see are chickens and pigs and humans all living together. You are such a nice man. Thank you very much. Pardon me. Oh, that is helpful. And yes, there's a shelf. All is well. All is well. Thank you. So the actual number since 1970 is about 3/4 of the new diseases that we're seeing are directly related to transmissibility from animals. But let's be careful about the term zoonotic. Zoonoses mean, yes, between animals and humans, but it definitely goes both ways. Things that humans get, we can give to animals. And it's very important to recognize that human infections can have livestock and wildlife implications that are very important to those of us that need to make a living associated with animals. And this is the other virus I wanted to show you. Pliny the Younger, writing 2,000 years ago, talked about blue tongue virus. And until 15 years ago, it had never been seen outside of the Mediterranean. And yet, beginning about 2000, it started to move. This is directly related to climate change, coupled with a half a dozen other factors. None of these things are simple, as Professor Arthur pointed out. There is complexity in everything. But this midge that is transmitting a virus that had never been seen outside of the Mediterranean in 2,000 years, in 15 years made it to Norway. In the process, it started infecting sheep in Belgium, sheep in Wales, sheep in Scotland, never been seen before, and the economic repercussions have been severe. Personally, I would like to blame climate change for many of these things because I happen to have a government in the United States that seems blindly stupid on this topic. But unfortunately, no, there are many reasons beyond climate change, but climate change is certainly a factor. I'm going to leave it at that. I would love to blame climate change. I cannot. And this is part of what I was mentioning when we talk about the intersection between humans and animals and zoonotic diseases. When we talk about recombinant influenza, when we talk about avian influenza and swine flu and H7N9 and all of the rest, this is just a diagram showing how these intersections are working in the real world. These are the things that are happening in farmyards, like you saw in Cambodia a moment ago, that allow viruses to leap from one species to another, and for the new species to gain a little bit of resistance, or for the bug to gain a little bit of capacity to live within that new host. That's important information. And the recognition that this recombination is taking place all day, every day, in the wild, in livestock, in humans, is important information, I think. So, the question is, and this is the only complicated slide I'm going to give you, what diseases are killing people now? This is not the complicated slide. This is the pretty slide. This is the complicated slide. So, let's take just a second to sort out this slide. In the world, about 57 million people die every year. Of those 57 million people, about 1/4 of them die from infectious diseases. When you look at which infectious diseases cause those 25% of deaths, you find that only about 5 cause 3/4 of those deaths. So did we work that okay? That was math. You went from 57 million dead, 1/4 of them is infectious diseases, and 5 of those infectious diseases cause most of those deaths. Those are pneumonia, HIV, diarrhea, tuberculosis, malaria. We'll get back to that. Got that so far? We're getting back to that. If you think that you would like to not die of an infectious disease, what country should you avoid? It turns out there is an answer. Stay away from Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe really is the hot spot of the world for the number of people infected by something day to day. And since Zimbabwe is the heart of that, is there anything in particular that has led to Zimbabwe being the central point for infectious diseases? Well, sort of. Laurie Garrett is a friend of several of us in the room. She's at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's a journalist. She's not a doctor, but she's written some fantastic books about public health and about emerging infections. This is probably her most famous from about 15 years ago. And she says these three things in the book. She says that when we look back on the 20th century, we're going to remember three spectacular scientific achievements. One was the splitting of the atom. The second was the unlocking of the genetic code. And the third is the building of the Kinshasa Highway. What does she mean by that? Well, Africa is a really, really big place. A spectacularly big place. Maps in the conventional Mercator projection do not do it justice. So you can fit the United States and China and India and Europe and Madagascar and the UK, and all of it fits inside the continent of Africa. So now that you've got that bit of information, let's look at where Kinshasa is, that highway that she talked about. Kinshasa is there, Democratic Republic of the Congo, one of the more oxymoronic titles for a nation anywhere on the planet. There it is, and there's the highway from the 1920s, starting with the blue line and then the extensions that are the red lines that you see there. What that wound up doing is taking everything that was in the middle of Africa and moving it to the coast, to ships, to planes, and out into the rest of the world. That's what it looked like. That's a photograph taken on the 1st of June in 1925, when it was the opening of all the resources of Africa to the rest of the world, and opening Africa to the colonial structures that would help them come along in the development of their civilizations. We'll call that optimism. It did not go very well. For many complicated reasons, things have not taken off, and the disintegration of the capacity for good governance has been impressive. And as a consequence, many infrastructural items of importance like water and sanitation and taxes, roads, have not been built effectively. The Economist gave it a very regrettable headline, and the photograph of the young boys is to remind myself to tell you that these are among the most dangerous animals on the planet. These are amoral children, often raised fearfully, and the goal of taking them from their families and forcing them to do horrible things has been to isolate them and make them entirely dependent on the armies of which they find themselves a part. These are very, very dangerous children. And another aspect of what the Kinshasa Highway has done is expose people who have never been exposed to anything else in their lives to something that is quite unfamiliar. These are Turkana that I was working with in northern Kenya a few years ago, and it is extremely difficult to communicate with them on anything like a common understanding of civilization, of cosmology, of culture. A little bit like what we're trying to do here, and that's why I put this slide in here, in a melding of East and West. It takes quite a bit of work to cross those boundaries each direction and each appreciate the other. And the issues are not just in Africa. I took this photograph on a branch of the Mekong Delta in Cambodia, near the Laotian border. And this kind of very close relationship between livestock and humans is common all over the planet. There's nothing specific in Southeast Asia or in Africa. You'd find the same anywhere that humans are still dependent upon the land. And then there are the things that we do to each other. that disrupt the systems that are supposed to protect civilization. This is a photo that won a Pulitzer Prize, and it is just representative of the kind of disruptions that make it very, very difficult to control issues in public health. And this is an example. I took this photograph in the ice market in Baghdad in 2003, where we had a cholera outbreak, and we had more people responding to the outbreak than we had actual cases. We know a great deal about how to manage cholera, and this outbreak was led by Denis Colombier out of WHO in Geneva, who is one of the world experts at controlling cholera outbreaks. But what we found was that the destruction of the electrical system in Iraq, coupled with the destruction of the water purification system, led to cholera growing in the water. When we got the water or the electrical system turned back on, that gave us the capacity to pump water, but we did not adequately control for the purification of that water that was being pumped. We had what is called point source chlorination. So at the tap, you would put a little bit of a chlorine packet into the water from your tap, but we forgot about the ice plant. So the cholera is in that ice. It's not in the water plant coming out of the taps that isn't controlled. It is, although the point source helped with that enormously, it's in the ice plant. We got electricity before we got chlorine. So let's go back to that complicated thing. Pneumonia. Pneumonia is the #1 killer in the world of both adults and children, and we're not supposed to see things like this: epidemic invasive pneumococcal pneumonia in a place like Canada. We're also not supposed to see a median age of 40. That's just wrong. Epidemiologically, that's just wrong. Something very curious was going on with that. And to be honest, I don't know what it was. And then, of course, there's children and pneumonia. And if you look, 7.6 million children every year die before their 5th birthday, and most of them die of pneumonia. We haven't fixed this problem at all. And by the way, many of those are bacterial, but not all. Many are viral as well. #2, you'll remember, was HIV. That's the most beautiful model of HIV ever done. It won a science award for visualization, but the numbers associated with HIV are still staggering. All right, 30 years into this epidemic, the numbers are huge. But it's no longer a disease that kills unreservedly. We now, if you get HAART, highly active antiretroviral therapy, you can live as if you have a chronic disease for an extended period of time. You remain somewhat infectious. So you can see the drawbacks of having people living longer with HIV and not getting adequate protection for transmissibility. It's a complicated problem. And that's particularly difficult because the place where HIV is most prevalent is the area with the fewest resources, sub-Saharan Africa. There is more happening in India than people have recognized until recently, and there's probably a great deal more happening in Russia than we're tracking, because just like tuberculosis becoming resistant inside Russian prisons, there is an underreporting of HIV in Russia. I won't go any farther into that. It's not my specialty, but there is more to that map than we can recognize. And then there's diarrhea. For those of you who would like to try a truly wonderful book, Rose George, a reporter, flushed her toilet and just casually wondered, where did that go? She was in New York City at the time. And she wound up going around the world to write this book. And it's a spectacular book, just wonderful reading about something that most of us never think about. And at least in the West, it's a relatively sensitive topic. I don't know about it in Asia. And it is true that 75% of all hospital beds in the world on any given day are occupied with some waterborne disease illness, usually diarrhea. 75% of all hospital beds are waterborne illness. So if we can separate human shit from drinking water, good things happen. Ask London. Right? The building of the embankment was a wonderful human achievement and has served as the model for the rest of the world. But it's not just human waste that has made it into our drinking water. There are now many other things that are not appropriately removed, and many of them you see listed there. There are consequences, but they're less acute. But those long-term consequences are bound to have civilizational impacts over the next 30 years. Here's an example of an acute problem. I led a team in the response to the earthquake in Haiti, and I took that photograph. You can watch a few weeks later as the rains came into that river valley, and that camp is destroyed on video. You watch it happen. You also watch the video filming the human waste, as we say, floating in the water in those tents. And the consequences, of course, were severe. Cholera broke out, carried probably from a UN person who was infected without actually being ill, and the consequences were over 500,000 sick and 8,000 dead off that river. As a matter of fact, that's the actual river where that infection was transmitted. We don't expect cholera outbreaks of that magnitude to take place in the modern world, but Haiti was an exceptionally broken place and so got out of control. Take note, it was an exceptionally broken place and got out of control. Look at any slum in a large city in the modern world, and you're going to see circumstances somewhat similar. Tuberculosis is number 4, and tuberculosis is an interesting problem. It is not, by and large, a Western problem. Let's take a look at that. As you can see, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, by and large, don't have much tuberculosis. Sub-Saharan Africa certainly does, we all know that, but look at Asia. Look at the incidence of TB from Russia all the way down to Indonesia. It's a very, very common disease, and we don't think about it very much, and yet we should. These are the absolute numbers from WHO. Now, part of this is driven by an increasing population, because the actual numbers getting a handle on tuberculosis incidence is improving. The Global TB 2013 report came out just recently, and the numbers look encouraging. But the absolute numbers are that, right? Wrong direction. And because of the difficulty in treating tuberculosis, it takes multiple drugs for an extended period of time for complicated reasons related to the life cycle of the parasite, you wind up with various levels of resistance, starting with those levels driven by those Russian prisons that I mentioned earlier. We had first multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, then extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis, and now we have totally drug-resistant tuberculosis. Every single one of these patients has died. That's not true for XDR-TB, that's not true for MDR-TB, it's not true for regular TB. People live with regular TB for years and years and years and years without reactivation. But if you have totally drug-resistant TB, it seems to be so that you just die, and you die very quickly. And last is malaria. Nobody thinks about malaria, but we really should, because that statement from Margaret Finkel in the National Geographic edition that was focused entirely on malaria has an amazing statement. Half of all humans who have ever lived died of malaria. Everything you see in red there is where malaria is common. 225 million cases about 1 human in every 32. It is not only associated with poverty, it is itself a cause of poverty. We probably miss many of the cases because they are happening in places where there is no visibility for epidemiologists or even physicians or even community health workers. We might see a doubling of the rate over the next while because 40% of all of the medications to treat TB in Southeast Asia are counterfeit. There's nothing there. People are taking the medication, thinking they're getting better, and there is nothing there. Counterfeit medications are an enormous problem. And something that many people, at least in the United States, do not recognize is that of the United States casualties in World War II, 60,000 died just from malaria. As many as died in the entire Vietnam War in the United States died of malaria in World War II. And unfortunately, because of the inadequacy of the medications currently treating malaria, we're now beginning to see resistant organisms, and that's not good. So, not only do we have those 5 killers, but we also have enzymes that are being transmitted from bug to bug to bug that build resistance. It started with a patient who showed up here in the UK from New Delhi after a traffic accident, and in the course of the next 15 months, less than a year and a half, that bug, well, the resistance enzymes within that bug showed up around the world. First time we'd seen it. This is what it looks like. This is a bug called Klebsiella, which has the resistance enzymes within it, and it should not be able to grow on that agar. There should be no growth at all on that plate. And it looks like there's no antibiotics at all. A year ago, there were 15 countries that had that enzyme present in its bacteria. As of 2 months ago, there are 12 countries just in the Americas. It's spreading that fast. So, heads up. And when we see things like that, we look for reasons. And Professor Arthur has been kind enough this morning to remind us that we are looking at systems of systems on systems, each one co-adapting, each one mutually independent, each one with non-linear responses. And when you look at all of the things that go wrong when civilization takes a turn for the worse. I spent some time working in Tajikistan, and Tajikistan I use as an example of just how many ways a country can go wrong. Everything that you see there is happening inside that little tiny country of 7 million people. Some aspect of those is happening all over everywhere. So, when we think about pandemics, we have a few terms that we use, and we're not going to go into these in any detail except that last one down here in the corner, the R naught. That's the number of people that each infected person can infect. And the numbers are usually around 1.5, 2, 2.5, 4 maybe. And some of the case fatality rates that we see, for example, in MERS, seem to indicate that maybe the transmissibility is more severe than we have seen in the past. And so when you hear people talking about the R naught, or the reproductive rate, heads up. Those are other terms that you can just take note of. You can read them for yourself, and we'll move on. There are 2 ways to move an organism from place to place. One is by actually touching it. The other is having it get on something and have that something move on to the next place. So that's direct versus indirect transmission. When we talk about pandemic and pandemic control, when we talk about what we're doing here at this conference in behavioral modification in the event of pandemics, keep in mind that there are many ways that bugs move from place to place. When we first see that an outbreak is underway, we do a lot to try to define exactly what we're looking at. Then we start taking the information we've gathered and we build numbers around it so we understand the characteristics, not just the who, what, when, where, and why. Then we figure out how the many things we've just measured might be wrong and other ways to interpret it, and then we begin to change. And this conference is all about action, right? Behavioral change, clinical change, community and environmental alterations. And we're going to hear in just a few minutes about the fantastic costs associated with these outbreaks. They cause some countries, smaller than China, but some countries to fall to their knees economically. There are ways to begin tracking more than we have in the past. This is one that you just heard mentioned. That was a TED Prize about detecting these disease outbreaks sooner. And there are people who do a very good job at this. This is the Japanese National Academy of Sciences that has outbreaks mapped all day, every day, updated several times a day, and there are a number of these services. GFIN, Argus, Health Map are others just like this around the world, and they work in a complementary fashion. And then as we begin to understand what is happening in an outbreak, we now have excellent tools to model what happens from that point. On that cheerful note, I want to take advantage of all the tools, all the knowledge, all the understanding that's represented in the room, recommend that you take a look at that movie when you get a chance, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you for a very comprehensive and very sobering presentation, delivered with quiet authority that is very impressive. These are facts we need to know and to understand. We're indebted to you. You haven't given us a lot in the way of answers, but we'll hope that we can come up with some in our forum for discussion at this conference.